In 1786, the second oldest Catholic parish in Kentucky was founded and named St. Charles. The early settlers fled to this area to avoid religious persecution in Maryland.
The Marylanders who came here came primarily from the county of St. Mary's, which is extreme southern Maryland. Other counties in southern Maryland that they came from were Charles County and then from Prince George's County. So there are three counties lined up going south from Washington, D.C. And we have a tombstone out here that says that a man was born in the District of Columbia. So they came primarily from those three counties. However, the elders, Bickett's, Flanagans, and Roneys came out of Frederick County. They came in droves from the spring of 1786, following a settlement that had been made on Pottinger's Creek in 1785, which is now today known as Holy Cross Parish. This community was known as the Hardins Creek Settlement because it was founded on the waters of Hardins Creek. The founders were the Bivens, Sissels, Mattingleys, Russells, Thompsons, Elders, Hamiltons, Mileses, Mudds, O'Daniels, Smiths, Williams, Wheatleys, and many others. Also founding members were the Protestant families of Browning, Buckler, and Peterson, many of whom intermarried with Catholics and converted to Catholicism. The people that came here came to Maryland as the third oldest English settlement in America in 1634 on the Ark and the Dove from England. So they had been in Maryland 152 years when they came here, and now they've been here 225 years here and 150 years in southern Maryland. By 1807, there were 10,000 Catholics in Kentucky, which was a huge percentage, primarily in the counties of Marion, Washington, and Nelson. Marion is the only county in the state that has more than 50% Catholic and is 51% Catholic. Until there was a church in this community, people met in the homes that had a room with a chapel in it. The priest would come about once a month to these different chapels, and he would bless the graves of those who had died and perform marriages and baptisms and have the Mass and the sacraments and preach. When this church was built in 1806 by Father Charles Neerinks, who was a Belgian missionary, there were about 600 people, 90 families. When they came here, this area was Nelson County, Virginia. Father Neerinks built a log church, and he lived in the one room on the back of the church that he used as his residence and as a sacristy to dress in for services. It's marked now by this crucifix set that was brought out there when the priest who had been buried at St. Mary's College were moved here. It was a log church. It faced the east like this other one did. When people are buried in this cemetery, their body faces east. It has to do with the fact that Gabriel's supposed to come out of the east on the Judgment Day. And I guess that's why the churches did the same. However, this one faces south, but the one that faced east. It was either blown down or torn down in 1832. The second church, which was built in 1832, 1833, stood until they tore it down after 1906, when this church was dedicated. That was done because the bishop said that they should not tear down the old church till this one was ready, because he was fearful that people would go other places to church, or people would stop going to church altogether if they tore the church down. And the reason they kept building another church was the parish grew so fast. St. Charles was picked because that was Father Charles Neerink's first name. It's named for St. Charles Borromeo, who was the first cardinal to be elected pope that turned down the papacy.
Surrounding the church is St. Charles Cemetery.
We feel sure that because Catholics believe in being buried in blessed ground, that the first ones that died are buried out there. The earliest stone is that of Joseph Mattingly Wheelwright right now. But the earliest one that I can prove with a document is that of Eleanor Pigeon Miles, who came out of the Pigeons and Hagans of Maryland and married into the Mileses and Dodds. She died in 1808, and she says in her will, "I wish to be buried in the Hardins Creek Catholic Chapel Yard." So they didn't even call it St. Charles Cemetery. I guess that was such a new name, and they had been called Hardins Creek Settlement for more than 25 years when she died. The cemetery on the west and north sides of this church goes back to 1786, when people came here from Maryland.
St. Charles Church has a strong connection to another organization in Marion County, which is celebrating its 200th anniversary in 2012.
In 1812, a historic event happened in this parish. 4 young women took veils as sisters, the first truly American sisterhood, now known as the Sisters of Loretto. At that time, they were called the Friends of Mary at the Foot of the Cross.
There was a bishop, one bishop, Bishop Carroll in Baltimore. And so they asked him, please send a priest. Well, they sent a vicar. It was an older man, and this young man, Father Stephen Theodore Baden. And Stephen Theodore Baden was a Servite from France, and he had left there. He left the seminary because of the oath that he would have to swear to the state. And so he came over here, and he was the first priest ordained in the United States. Very first priest ordained here. And so then he came, and he was a very, very bright young man. He came with this older guy to be like an apprentice. The older guy left and went back, whatever. And so then the letter came, and here was Father Baden, and he was in charge. And he became the circuit rider for all these Catholic parishes. And he would say Mass in their homes. And so he asked for help. He asked young women for help to teach catechism. And he asked Bishop Carroll for help. And Bishop Carroll sent different priests. When Father Nearings came, he lived on this hill with Father Baden. Father Baden was given this form because at that time they didn't give them a salary. They didn't have any money around here. And so they didn't give him a salary, they gave him land. And they said, the land will take care of you. So he had a land, and he had a little family that evidently, provided his food when he was here. And he had a cabin and a little bitty chapel, all wood. And so that was how he started out as a circuit rider. And when Father Nearings came, he joined him right here. And the two of them were great companions. Father Nearings did not like house masses at all. They were too small. So wherever he would go, he would ask the people to build a church. And he would say, you bring 2 logs, and you bring 2 logs, and you bring 2 logs, a certain length on a certain date. And they would put up the churches. And Father Nearings was known as the church builder. And one of the families was called the Rhodes family. And Bennett Rhodes had come here in the late 1700s and had married a Medley. And they had children. And so when his sister Mary came, she lived with him. And she thought, what I can do is I can help, because there aren't any schools, and I can help with the reading, writing, and arithmetic and the catechism, because she was trained in that in Maryland. She also had a sister, and her sister lived over at Gethsemane at the dance home. And her name was Anne. And she had tuberculosis, because a lot of illness at that time. Anyway, Mary Rhodes wanted to teach these youngsters, but her brother said, this is getting too much, because the neighbors wanted to send their children in. And so he gave them a cabin down in the hill, just lower than your church. You look down in the valley and that's the site. And they had a little school down there. And it had a leaky roof, and it had a mud floor, and it had a stump in it with a board across it. And they put in a loft, and they put mats up there. So at nighttime, they could pull the mats down, and the people could sleep on it, the youngsters or the sisters. Bennett Rhodes, he wanted his children educated, but he didn't want his house overtaken. And his sister Mary had two friends, Christina Stewart and Ann Havern. So those three women together worked down in that school. And but they, as time went by, they saw that they needed another cabin. So they started to build another cabin, and Father Nearing's on one of his circuits, because he was a circuit rider, just as Father Baden was. He stopped by and he said, you know, I could help you with that. And they said, well, yes, but what we really want is, you know, we would like to have you do something else, to write us a rule, because we would like to dedicate our lives to God and to this work of serving these children in this area. And Father Nearing said that he could get help from Europe, and they said no, that they were different and that they needed, you know, to do their thing right here. Well, the three of them, Mary Rose, Christina Stewart, and Ann Havern, when they asked Father Nearing's consulted Bishop Flaget. And so it was okayed. And so the parish of St. Charles, right up there on the hill, one day, April 25th in 1812, there was a procession of the school children and the families and these three women up to the church. And they received a veil at that time, and they dedicated their lives. Well, this was a big mystery, you know, of course, to the people, but something that they, you know, very well understood and appreciated. And in June, they had three more people who joined them, so then they were 6. And it was like they were going to grow. And at that time, Ann Rhodes, Mary Rhodes' sister, came. When she came, right away, they elected her. She was the youngest. She was just 19 years old. And they elected her as the Mother Superior, or the Dear Mother. And so she right away sold what she had, bought that piece of small piece of land for $75. And the neighbors helped them to start building. And Father Nearing's had a plan that it would be like a compound, so that there was a school and a church and a convent, and over here Father Nearing's had a house, had 2 rooms in it, one for himself and one for whoever came to visit, like the bishop, because Bishop Flaget was part of this by that time. Now, the 3 women, plus all those who had joined them, were living 10 miles over here at St. Mary's, over at St. Charles, down at the school. And they were getting more people coming in. And as they did, then they sent off to Calvary and started their second school at Calvary. It was called St. Mary's. Then that was in 1816. In 1818, the Dant family gave them the land at Gethsemane, and for a school for poor girls. So they went there and they started a school in 1818, and they were there for 30 years until they sold it to the Trappists. And so all of these things tie together, you know. First of all, there were the parishioners, who were the most important. And then there were these priests who were real apostles. Okay, well, the sisters down there were doing their job. They also raised money to buy land. And they bought the piece of land next to them. I think it was called the Ray Farm, and it had grist mill. And it was 300 acres, and they bought it for $3,000. And they were going to build a boys' school. And Father Nearings was going to go to Europe and get young men to be brothers. So there would be a brotherhood and a sisterhood. Well, during the time while he was away, Father Burns started the school and got a good start on it and really got a good thing going. But it started with the sisters going out and asking the people in the neighborhood for the money. In 1824, Father Nearings had returned from Europe, and he was making a trip up into Missouri. He got a fever, a disease. He went to St. Genevieve. He died very quickly, and it was a great sorrow. And Bishop Flagey came out to St. Charles, to Little Loretto, as they called it, and he stayed there with the sisters for 2 weeks and talked to them about change was going to have to happen, and that he recommended that they live on this land over here, that they do a transfer of property, because the sisters owned their own little piece of land that Ann Roses bought, plus the land that they bought for the boys' school. They owned all of that. And the bishop really preferred that they would live here on St. C. Stephen's farm because nobody was living here at that time. And so they did a transfer of property. And the sisters came over. And when they left St. Charles, the story is that they burned the buildings. Some say because they held them sacred, others because they needed the nails. And whenever you were going to build new buildings, and they would have to build new buildings, you needed nails and hinges and things of that sort. And so they came over here in their wagons. But they left Father Nearings's cabin, and Father Nearings's cabin was still standing. And in 1895, the Mother Superior here asked again, please, may we have that cabin? And at that time, they had sold the land to a family, the Austin Smith family. And they asked if they could please have that cabin. And Austin Smith, an African American, said that he was very attached to it and to the memory of it, and he would give half of it. And so he gave half the logs and not the foundation, because I think he was going to build back on, and he and his wife were going to live there. And they did, and they brought the logs over, and they constructed a little log cabin that we call Father Nearings's cabin that we have here. It is you will see the same logs, but it is a different structure. It's only one room.
The property where the Sisters of Loretto first established is now owned by Keyes Thompson. His son, Joe Thompson, took us on a tour of their property.
He said all of this was their community. Like I said, from that fence line to where it breaks off to the other line, where the trees is, that's where the father's house is supposed to have been at. This is where they said, we called it the chimney. That's where the rock foundation from his place was all just right in there. Like I said, bushes done growed up all over it now, but that's where Father's house was at. This is where they got their water. Well, I mean, it's down there probably a good 40 foot.
A second really historic event that this parish had a part in was the establishment of St. Mary's College, which was down the road about 1.5 miles. Father Charles Nearings raised $3,000 from this parish and other parishes around, which would be a tremendous sum in today's money, and purchased a 200-acre farm from Joseph Ray, which became the St. Mary's College Farm. now is a private prison. The seminary college was founded in 1821 by Father William Byrne, who later became pastor of this church and died of the Asiatic cholera epidemic of 1833 after administering the last rites to a parishioner. They lasted until 1976. When they closed in 1976, they were the third oldest existing Catholic college in America. They were a college until 1929 when they became a seminary for the training of priests.
The heart and soul of any parish is its parishioners, and St. Charles has several parishioners who have been part of the parish for many decades. We had the opportunity to speak with them and hear some of their remembrances.
Oh, yes, pie suppers. That's where I caught my husband. I made a big chocolate pie, and he bought it, and it was so good that he wanted me to be the pie baker.
He just bought you too, didn't he?
I was born and raised and everything right in St. Charles.
We always had a picnic, and the children, they all loved to go to the picnic. Back in those days, a box of Cracker Jacks was such a thrill, and an ice cream cone.
In fact, that's the only thing I know of in the parish. It would be the highlight of the year. Would be the picnic at St. Charles. And I remember when they used to have the old brass band sitting on the wagon there with the old school there where it was, they'd pound on them horns and beat them drums all through the picnic. Then, of course, you had to make sure you got through by 5 o'clock when it started getting dark, and the picnic was all over. And one of the big things I remember at the picnic was that it was a big thing then to serve a slice of cake with a glass of lemonade, and they'd make that lemonade in an old whiskey barrel and make it full of lemonade. And of course, the picnic is over, they'd still have it left, and all those kids get to drink that lemonade what was left. So that was always, as far as I know, that's the biggest thrill that St. Charles ever had was a picnic.
Well, I married my wife in 1946, and she's from St. Charles. I've been there about ever since, except I did live at the farm down between Raven and St. Francis, and I lived down there 23 years. Well, it was a cold, frosty morning, like February the 28th. Oh, it's kind of early in the morning, remember. They used to have weddings early. I think it's about probably 8 or 9 o'clock. And it's frosty. I remember it was frosty morning that morning.
About 45 or 46, we moved into the parish. Well, I was president of the Altar Society. You remember they used to have Altar Societies? I was president that, I don't remember what year that was, but they've done away with that now, but I was president that, and I enjoyed that. We had meetings once a month, I believe, and then we'd have dances. It's the last time I guess they ever had a dance. You remember any dance at St. Charles? Father Waldy was there. You remember Father Waldy? Oh, yes. Well, at the time, we paid our dues and are supposed to keep up like the holy water and blessed candles, the things that we were supposed to pay for the things at the altar, like blessed candles and holy water and whatever they had, little things. Sidney joined the Holy Name. And he thought it was going to be about the Blessed Sacrament, Well, if you knew anything about Father Dudney, he was a ball player. So we went to one of the meetings and all they talked about was ball, and Sidney wasn't in the ball at all. He wasn't in the ball, but anyway, he thought he was going to talk, more about the church, but Father Dudney was a great ball fan.
Oh, I remember the old organ. We get to pump it. We all thought that was a great thing. The nuns would play the organ, we'd sit there and pump that old handle up and down. And sometimes you'd kind of halfway go to sleep, and they would holler at you, pump up, pump, and then you have to crank up again. You had a little gauge there where had a screw in it, And when you had it at the right air, you know, it hung there. But if you kind of stop for a second there, you know, that'd drop down. That's when the sister would, blah, 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 you just start hollering, you bump that organ.
They heated the building with stoves, and they had a big, they called them potbelly stoves, on each side under the choir side. And that was our heating at that time.
I remember I done get up about 12, 1 o'clock at night. If it's cold, go up and fill it up. Yeah, then it'd be smoked up. You didn't get up by time, it'd be to smoke the whole church up. If it's real bad weather, you fill it up. No, you fill it up twice. I filled it up about 5 or 6 o'clock. And about 12, 1, I'll go back and fill it up again in the night.
Father Menzie baptized me, and then the next priest that I remember would be Father Frank at St. Mary's College, and then we had 2 or 3 different priests there from St. Mary's College was a pastor there, but Father Frank I know. And of course, Father, in the latter years, Father Spielmacher, he come in there and stayed a year or 2. But there's any number of them there. Father Ritz.
Father Canor.
Yeah, Father, that's the one that stayed a year, and then he, when he left, I don't know what parish he went to, but he died. He died.
After Father Canor was Father Hagen.
Father Hagen.
Was Spalding, Father Billy.
Father Billy stayed there 1 year. Then Father Waldy came.
He was there for years.
Father Waldy, he gave the best talks, shortest talks I thought of anybody. He could give the best talks in such a short time. But poor Father Dudney, he was seen on earth, but he talked a long time. But whenever you're holding it, that's when Tony was a baby, I guess. When you're holding a baby, and sometimes they get tired and you get too, you kind of wish you cut a little shorter, but anyway. But poor Father Dudney was seen on. And walk up and down those communion rails, you know, where they did then, and poor man couldn't hardly get his breath. I guess he did have heart trouble. And he looked like couldn't hardly get his breath. He'd go one end of the communion rail into the other.
We had them out in the yard them days.
Yeah.
Picnics.
Yeah.
Once a year we had a bingo outside. It was very good.
Yes, they were all baptized, made their first communion and their first confession, and they were confirmed at St. Charles. And 2 of our daughters married at St. Charles. Their marriages were there. Oh yes, when the Archbishop came, it was very, very important. We've got pictures of all of them with the Archbishop, you know, and it's quite a thrill to have him to come, because they didn't travel around like they do today. The archbishops now, every day they have a schedule where they go somewhere, but that wasn't that way in the older days.
I remember Father Tony was altar boy. Tony and Joe were both altar boys, Father Waldy's. I remember I don't know why, but one time I went, of course, Joe and Tony's kids, then I had to drive and took them to 6 o'clock mass back those days, you know. And Joe come out crying. Joe, why are you crying? I said, well, Father didn't give him communion. Now, why? I don't know, but anyway, he came out crying and said, Father didn't give him communion, so I never didn't know why I didn't, but anyway, I know Joe was upset about it. Tony fainted on the altar. I don't guess, no, it wasn't. Those days, you know, you couldn't eat breakfast before you went to communion. And Tony fainted on the steps. And I went to help him up, and Father pointed to me to go back, and he went to him. And then Ike Magdalene went up to help Tony up. Of course, he wasn't out very long, but then we passed out a second. So anyway, Ike Magdalene, I'll never forget, Ike Magdalene went up.
When Father Vince there, we had a meeting about once a month, and we named all them sections, different sections, but I don't know if they changed them now or not. One of them there, behind the church, they call it behind the church, And down on the other way, down the hill, they call it Valley View. And I don't remember what they call the other one, way over back in there where they opened up a new part of the cemetery, haven't they, Larry? Yeah. Down in the valley there, like on a, but I don't know what they call that, but I don't even, well, yeah, we used to have a working every so often, you know, and go out there and straighten up the tombstones and try to get some dirt hauled in and put it in the graves where they'd soak in, and we sprayed the trees for bagworms. They got real bad there. They've cut some of them down, though. They had one right there by Billy Costello's grave, and it's gone now.
I think one of the biggest things I've ever noticed around the church back when I was growing up and I was an altar boy, that anything, any sacred vessel around there, you had to get a cloth to carry it. You couldn't just walk up the way they do now. Anybody walk up with the chalice and just take off with it. But everything you had to have a cloth with it. And in communion time there, if a priest dropped the hose, or if you did yourself, but most time it'd be the priest there, they would mark that. And after Mass, they'd come in there with a pan of water and scrub that floor. I've seen Father Dooney just sit there for 5 minutes going wherever that hose dropped. But now, if they drop it, they pick it up, and most time the priest will consume it themselves.
You know, I like St. Charles very much. I've lived there. I went to church there more than I did at St. Francis Xavier at Ravik, where I grew up and made all my first communion, confirmation, all that. But I've lived in St. Charles longer.
But it was a very nice trip and place to go.
St. Charles people are the friendliest people.